On the 28th of August 1831, the Atlas newspaper wrote, "The ingenuity with which he constructs this music is quite original. The accompanists on the pianoforte, violoncello and double bass had nothing more to do than to iterate alternately the chords of the dominant and the tonic of the key of D minor upon the pedal note A. To this accompaniment, Paganini improvised a number of delightful and playful melodies. Gradually, however, departing from the key, he surprised his hearers with such a lively imitation of a hen's clucking after she has laid an egg that it was impossible to conceive anything surpassing the humour. It was imitated to the utmost nicety. This extraordinary whim was encored with clamours of applause and laughter, and Paganini himself did not pretend to gravity." Now here's the opening of the most famous documentation that we have of Paganini improvising. Now, if there's one thing and only one thing which would surprise early 19th century musicians and listeners about the future approach to their music, it would be how the world of classical music came to abandon improvisation. It's worth remembering that the comprehensive modern notion of playing Paganini, the playing everything idea, was rather a new phenomenon. When I was a child, any player who played more than a handful of the caprices was regarded as a bit of a freak, and there were, and still are, plenty of notable players who achieved solo careers whilst avoiding his work altogether. Let's not forget that Jascha Heifetz played a bare minimum of his pieces, though it's worth noting he was the purveyor of the best moto perpetuo. But the post-Ruggero Ricci generation of violinists introduced an extremely clean style of playing Paganini, driven in part by the demands of the recording industry, and later on to a lesser extent by the birth of a, shall we call it, particularly sterile type of, I use the word, competition violin playing. Viotti's teacher, who Paganini much admired, was Pugnani, and he was noted for the enormous freedom of his improvisations. Here's a report. Once, whilst playing a cadence before a large audience, he quite forgot himself and walked about in the middle of the room till he'd finished it, quite unconscious that he was not alone. On another occasion he said to a friend near him, "Do pray that I get safely back." A few days ago, watching the online chit-chat between musicians, a minor storm in a teacup, a squall drifted across my screen. Some players squared off, pianists actually, over the questions whether it was okay to play cadenzas by two different composers in a Mozart or Beethoven piano concerto. I briefly considered stepping in, but then noticed that one word was not coming up, and that was the word improvisation. The most important skill for a performer on either side of the Napoleonic Wars, and it didn't surface in what was actually a kind of virtual bar fight over the ethics of what to do in improvisational spaces in concerti written in the Revolutionary Age. Until well into the 19th century, improvising was seen as the primary function of the performer, who would be and was a composer. We sometimes observe at that time publishers pulling their composers back from interfering too much with their paying customers' freedom to ornament and embellish the music they were publishing themselves. It's worth saying that if you remember that the majority of money that people spent on music, apart from going to concerts, was buying music for themselves to play, that music not only being playable, but providing space for the performer to do their thing, had to work. There's an example of this by the Parisian composer and publisher Pacini, who would later work with Paganini. Now, in 1815, Pacini published a transcription of Beethoven's C major piano sonata opus 2 No. 3. That's D, and he published a version of it for string quartet. Now, Beethoven's original published piano version, which was published by Altare in 1802, has quite an extensive, but quite simple cadenza in the last movement. The straightforward nature of that already indicating to me that the composer had thought at least, or perhaps had had a conversation with the publisher about making sure he provided material which was sight-readable by the amateurs who were going to play the music. We don't have the manuscript, so we can't tell. In Pacini's string quartet transcription, this cadenza is excised, just replaced by a chord with a fermata indication, familiar from every cadenza point of the age. So when we play it in the quartet, our cellist improvises a cadenza. But the surprise of those 19th century musicians wouldn't be confined to the question of improvisation, but by extension, how the abandonment of those techniques resulted in what I've described earlier as a kind of note-counting approach to the performance of the very music which was designed by performer, composer, improvisers to show off the breadth and brilliance of their talents, not just as executors. So in this world which was dominated by extemporizers, Paganini's success in ending orchestral concerts completely alone, with just the violin as the final work on programs including symphonies, arias, concertos and overtures, was attributed to his incredible array of improvisatory skills and a magnetism which he brought to works such as the variations that follow the Prelude which I just played. That's the Prelude to Nel Corpi non mi sento, his variations on Paisiello, which we're going to be dancing around today. Late in life, he wrote the following: "Every 5 years I changed my style of playing, and for the first time in Bologna in 1814, I improvised with Rossini at the piano." We'll come back to that. It was noted by the middle of the decade in which Paganini brought his career to its height, that's the 1830s, that the skills of playing in this way were in decline. When Pierre Baillot published his masterpiece, which is still, in my opinion, the greatest teaching work ever written for the violin, L'Art de Violon, which came out in 1834, he included examples of improvised materials in all the keys. He noted, by then, young players had no idea how to improvise. The old skill had evaporated. There are pages of preludes in all the keys which are both melodic and chordal. And these are clearly exercises for improvisation, or rather exercises to develop the skill of improvisation. I'll give you a couple of examples. So here is an example of chordal materials in A minor. It gets gradually more chromatic. So that's a typical page of chordal material. It's worth remembering that it was the French who first published techniques for string instruments with full scale accompaniments for another instrument. In fact, scale accompaniments for L'Art de Violon, which were reprints, they'd been first used in the method which he published with Kreutzer and Rode in 1804, were actually written by Cherubini, and they're miraculous. It's worth just buying the book to play the scales and have someone play the scale accompaniments with you. But then there's a melodic material. So here's an example of that. So you get something like this. there's lots of material like this, which is, and he makes a point of noting that it is without theme. There are pages and pages of themeless improvisatory material, which if you study them, it gives you kind of primer for how to do it. Baio was one of the very last orchestral leaders who would improvise in the midst of symphonic works. So when they played Haydn slow movements and he was leading, he would decorate the first violin line from the leader's chair. Modern players, and I'm using the word carefully, I'm just thinking about the modern symphonic tradition at the moment, are unwilling to play extempore. Many of them are unaware that this is the tradition which even, say, Haydn and Mozart symphonies were designed to elicit. Think about it. Beethoven's oboe cadenza in the Fifth Symphony is only unique in the fact that it was written out. Beethoven is documenting what happened. He's not documenting something extraordinary. And you could even go further. You could say, if you think of the sublime violin writing of the slow movement of the violin concerto, what's extraordinary, especially bearing in mind the simplicity of what's going on in the orchestra at that moment, is that it was written out. And if you think of that, you could go further. Even the violin writing, and I'm prepared to be shot for saying this, in the decorative material in the Benedictus from the Missa Solemnis, might not be seen so much as a formal concertante, but examples of the kind of things that happened anyway, I admit, elevated to the most extraordinary level. So one of the ironic results of the newly systemized technical training, which had come in, if you like, from Paris with the very school which Kreutzer and Rode and Baio had initiated, which was so much admired by Paganini, was that after 25 years, he found that these students, because of being so well trained, had lost the gift of improvising. It was not something which would be developed well in the new way of doing things, which was, if you like, removed from the nature of an apprenticeship, which being in a patronized orchestra was. Thus, to illustrate it, if you went into the Esterhazy orchestra when Haydn was there, and you had this amazing group of people with the very young Dragonetti playing double bass and Anton Kraft playing first cello, and you sat at the back of the second violins, you found your way in by effectively being dragged along by the person next to you, and you were taught these bits and pieces by getting it wrong until you got it right, which is the nature of an apprenticeship. That having gone because the patronized world of music making went with the revolution, removed the ability to learn like that, and a systemized manner of teaching couldn't replace that approach. Just to show how extreme this is, La de Villon, Baio's masterpiece, also offers cadenzas for a Pleyel quartet. And by the standards of today, these are disrespectful both to the composer and the other players. The number of bars of first violin cadenza in the slow movement exceed those actually written by the composer in the whole movement. Baio offers an improvised cadenza for the first violin, which is longer than the movement. Gradually, improvisation moved away from serious music, and if you wanted to hear it in the late 1830s and 1840s in Paris, if you wanted to hear it being done by a whole ensemble, you needed to go to the world of the boulevard theatres, where whole orchestras would accompany plays, melodramas, not using scores, but with marked up scripts which had instructions along down the side instructing the orchestra they needed to produce the music for storms or for love or for a fire, etc., etc., etc. as they went. Amateurs in the mid-19th century started to want to be assured that they were buying exactly what composers and virtuosi performed as they were performing it. Now, the harpist and kind of great flaneur, Nicolas Charles Boxer, began his Souvenir de Paganini, which was a transcription with a preface assuring his public that the right hand of this harp piece reproduced or enabled the purchaser to recreate exactly what Paganini played on the violin. A quarter of a century earlier, Bartolomeo Campagnoli had released his magnum opus, which was 246 preludes, cadenzas and fantasias in all the keys, second-guessing that gap which was going to emerge. Here's a glimpse of how improvising worked in Paganini's era. So in 1829, Chopin was invited to a supper at a Vienna salon. He was asked to improvise variations. He asked for a theme and was asked to vary the prayer from Rossini's sacred opera Mose in Egitto, Moses in Egypt, which is this. Which, of course, ironically, that had already been most popularized, not by the opera, which was a disaster, but by Paganini's sonata alla preghiera, referred to rather prosaically as the Moses variations. So Chopin was asked to make a set of variations on a theme because the Viennese audience had heard Paganini do it. But this technique of variation, improvisation, is as old as music itself. That's obvious. I almost shouldn't read on to say that. Perhaps it's a good idea to look at a simple pair of variations on Gluck from a French composer of the generation before, Michel Voldemar, who's a bit of a favourite of mine, just to observe two of the fundamentals as they applied to string playing. The first, as I indicated in the example I showed earlier by Pierre Baillot, was chordal, and the second is vocal, the techniques used on a fermato, what the French called les points d'orgue. So the theme which is being varied is the wonderful theme by Gluck, Objet de mon amour, je te demande un jour avant l'aurore. This theme. So the first variant is the chordal one. So here's the melodic variation. It's worth remembering that listeners were versed in these techniques. Audience knew what they were listening for. They knew what to listen out for. And at a basic level, they reach back to the 17th century notion of division, which of course means exactly what it says. The idea that you take a melody and you elaborate it by dividing it up. So if you take something like Balthazar's variations on Come John Kiss Me Now, which is you divide it up like a... and you divide it again. I'm not suggesting that Paganini was working with 17th century principles, but simply to say that that was hardwired into every improvising player. And it's impossible for me to play that theme, even with the divisions coming from Balthazar, without elaborating themselves as I go. It's harmonically so simple that you can't avoid doing it. And remember that description I gave at the beginning of Paganini improvising in London with that bass going backwards and forwards between what they're deciding is this on an A pedal, dying to know what he was doing. I think it's a good idea to take what we know of Paganini's own approach to improvising and the changing versions of the Paisiello variations, which have the wonderful title Nel cor più non mi sento, alongside some of the work of his imitators and rivals, to paint a picture, however rough, of what we're missing, because it's clear we're missing a lot. Now, Giovanni Paisiello, who's not really celebrated much these days, although when I was young and I was working with Hans Werner Henze, Henze was addicted to his music and loved it. After 8 years under the patronage of Catherine the Great, he made the first operatic version of Barbara of Seville, came back to Italy in 1784, became Napoleon's favourite composer for a while, and he's director of choral music for his rather dramatic coronation in 1804. Now, his opera, La Molinara, from which Nel cor più comes, was one of the most successful operas in Vienna and was produced in German, wait for it, as Die Schöne Müllerin. It was still being produced again and again in the 1820s. It's dominated by pastoral rhythms and, of course, I'm very, very sure that something of the essence of that opera found its way into Schubert's mind. That we'll leave that as it is. The melody, which was incredibly popular all across Europe, was translated in English as Hope Told a Flattering Tale. Rather different in German, is translated as Mich fliehen alle Freuden, so all my joy has gone. If you look at Whistling's Handbook, which is only for nerds, it's the document which came out every year in Austria as to all the music published, you'll find that in 1825 alone there were variations available for piano by composers including Gelinek, Hummel, Van Hal, Gabler, Glichnowsky, and of course Beethoven. Because he improvised on this little pastoral and only set it to variations after he went to the opera one night in Vienna and a young lady in the box next to him said, "I really want a copy of your new piece based on La Molinara," because she'd heard him improvise and wanted the copy of the sheet music. So he had to actually write the sheet music in order to be able to sell it, which he therefore did. Moreover, the Italian violinist Pellegro, with whom Beethoven gave a concert for flood victims in Baden in 1812, played a set of his variations of that concert, although I think probably what happened was that they improvised on Beethoven's own set. Now, the reason I'm talking about Pellegro is it's very likely that Pellegro influenced Paganini's own style. They both came from Piedmont, and if you look at Pellegro's two violin concertos, they're full of gestures which we would say were Paganini-esque, but written 20 years before Paganini. Indeed, in 1823, there was a letter written to the Ricordi Company from Dresden that Pellegro was leaving his position as concertmeister of the Dresden Court Orchestra. And Mollaki, who wrote the letter, suggested it would be a really good idea to have another Piemontese violinist take it over, and suggested that it might even be valuable enough, well paid enough, to attract Paganini. The post is very prestigious and lucrative. Will Paganini accept it? Will Paganini, who never accepted a leader's post, though he did accept a music director's post, was never going to take the leadership of that orchestra? Paganini left 3 versions of this set of variations, or perhaps you can say 4. 3 are in his hand, and the 4th is in the hand of the violinist and Kapellmeister Karl Guhr. One of these, the manuscript can be found in the British Library, is effectively a miniature concerto, albeit for violin with cello, another violin, in A major, bears no resemblance to the solo versions, which are in G major. The most well-known version consists of the dramatic introduction you just heard, with 6 variations in coda, following the theme. Now, I just want to play you this version of the theme to show immediately what was happening. One would normally expect a theme and variations to begin with the theme, as the Germans would say, blatt und glatt, absolutely without ornament. But of course, if you're going to play a theme just on the violin by itself, playing a theme by itself is rather bare anyway, so you're going to have to do something. So Paganini's version of this theme, by the time we get to here, was this. So remember, the theme originally becomes this. That is the piece which on his first appearance in London caused the most consternation amongst the critics. They described it in enormous detail. Of course, what you're hearing is twofold. You're hearing the kind of ornamentation which Piabaio was talking about. So this becomes... Now that is pure vocal ornamentation. And Paganini, in his letters when he was a young man, made a real point of going to concerts and writing out as much as he could what the singers he admired did. I mentioned last week that it went as far as that he wrote out the ornamentation by the great Angelica Catalani in 1820. So that's the one side. And on the other side, you have his fabled simultaneous pizzicato, which is much easier, by the way, on nice thick gut strings, the 6 variations provided Paganini with an opportunity to run through his kind of gamut of techniques, and I'm going to come to those later. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The other complete version of this set of variations, the version I just played you, is the latest set we have by Paganini. It's very different. It consists of the theme, as I just played it, but rather less complicated, and a capriccio, which is related or might be seen as an early version of the 6th variation and coda of the more well-known version. I just want to suggest something really simple, which is these 2 versions offer us a really exciting opportunity to witness how a player develops an idea, a performance through repeated performance involving improvisation. So how do we know we're looking at that process? Because there's a relationship between the development of what we've come to call interpretation and the end of the use of improvisation. Not sure it's something that Paganini's generation would recognize. I'm sure that in a classical music world dominated by improvising and its appreciation by audiences, that how so-and-so played the phrase at bar 290 would not necessarily seen as something which listeners were that interested in. And if you spend any time around jazz musicians and thinking about what they find interesting, the essence of improvising and expression is not based on the turning of well-known phrases in ever more subtle and refined ways. It's to do with, actually, the true meaning of virtuosity, which is related to the word virtue, of course. It's a question of truth, actually. Indeed, until the wide availability of recorded music, no one could really be that au fait with what a player did, because except in those activities where audiences, those who could afford it, could attend the opera. Because if you went to the opera, you went to the same opera night after night after night after night, because until the run ended, because you had your box in which you had your meals, in which you lived, and which you did everything, and sometimes you took notice of what was going on, other times you closed the curtains. You became aware of what the singers were doing, which explains something of the fascination with vocal technique in the 1700s, early 1800s. But this was never the case with instrumental performance. Even Paganini, who had a very small repertoire compared to a modern performer, had to vary performances if he played on consecutive nights in the same venue. He couldn't give the same program twice, whereas the same opera was given night after night after night after night, which meant that there wasn't an opportunity for what we've now come to, if I dare use the word, fetishize the idea of interpretation. Simply, it's not a word that even is talked about. Now, there is, in my experience, quite a lot of resistance to the very idea of Paganini as a improviser. One authority, an eminence grise that I talked to many years ago about this, was very upset when I pointed out that there was no contradiction between that early version of Nel Colpiu and the version which is played today. Quite clearly, one is a composition, and the other a documented act of improvising, enfolding another reading of that composition. If you think about the premiere of Beethoven's choral fantasy for piano and orchestra and choir. Even today, when the orchestra comes in for the first time, after the piano has played the theme and a few variations, there's always a rather creaking moment because everyone's really quite sure whether it's the right place to come in. I've been involved in performances where there was more than a dodgy gear change at that moment. And the origin of this was because the original version of that was Beethoven improvised a set of variations until he waved at the orchestra to start getting involved. It was chaos, of course, and the chaos kind of attended nearly every performance since. It's fairly obvious to me the opening introduction is improvising, but I want to just maybe shock you a little bit. Here's the coda of the early version of Nell Core. This is just the last few bars. And then the later version has turned into this. And then we get to another coda. Now it's very clear that these two are related to each other. But what's a bit of a shock for any of us who grew up playing when you're young, struggling with the caprices and the concertos, is that first coda. I've seen Paganini's manuscript. It's so simple. It's open strings. I mean, I know no other place where Paganini wrote out just three crotchets of open strings. It makes me remember my first experience of undisciplined violin playing, which was at my primary school, where we had something approaching an orchestra. Naturally, practice you did at home was supposed to be organised and regulated. And I remember my first professor, who was the wonderful teacher Beatrix Marr, berating me for noodling on the instrument. It was fiercely discouraged. That situation has changed now, and now if a young player was to make up things on the violin, it's unlikely they would be discouraged. But I do remember those early, incredibly chaotic, I don't call them rehearsals, at my primary school, where there was the first time there's the opportunity to stand in a room, not while the rehearsal was going on, but round the rehearsal, and play the violin as loudly as you possibly could, while other people honked on their instruments at the same time. And I remember discovering and standing there for hours doing this, which is not music, but perhaps, there's something of that. There's these basic things. The obvious thing is that low positions and open strings are not generally associated with what we come to define as virtuosity, but they are fundamental to effective solo, and I mean really effective, real solo playing, that's playing alone. Put it like this: if you go to a concert of the violin by itself, and the whole concert is played up the instrument like this, it's a painful experience. However, if you go, most of the great music for the violin alone is dominated by the rigging part of the violin. Think of the beginning of the Bartók Solo Sonata. Even in his quartets, he doesn't allow himself to spend that much time down on the bottom of the violin. And the person who understood this best, in the piece which in some ways is an unaccompanied violin piece with people sitting around it, with Stravinsky, his Soldier's Tale, is basically nearly entirely in the first position. He needs that resonance. Even in this complicated set of variations, Paganini has a kind of constant return to the foundations of security. This involves a gazetteer, if you like, of his standard improvisational licks. So, for instance, like descending ricochet scales, which, if you think of it, or which could also be plicated staccato, which relate to the 15th caprice, or double-stopped harmonics, which are in the variations almost identical to the ones that you find in the last movement of the second concerto, La Campanella. And of course, his favourite way of writing simple chords, which is da-da-da, rhythms. These are standard tropes, if you like. The whole of the set of variations, there isn't really material which you could define as being composed. And this is demonstrable through harmonic or technical complexity. So if I give you, for instance, two little corners from the 20th Caprice, here's an example of things which can't be improvised. You wouldn't dream of suddenly improvising not in a chance, or from a harmonic point of view, That's composition. That's not improvising. You can see the two things moving towards each other. And of course, the other thing is chains of diminished seventh arpeggiations. My very long-suffering first harmony teacher and organ teacher when I was in my mid-teens going to the academy in the middle of the week, Hugh Marchand, was one of the organists at the coronation in 1953. He'd studied with Vierne in Paris, and he pointed out the most obvious thing about diminished sevenths, which is they are the simplest go-to. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you thwack a diminished seventh chord down there, you can go anywhere. It is it's the equivalent of a cymbal crash. No one remembers what happened before or after diminished seventh. Every single improviser knows that, so that's one of your kind of clues. So now a bit of a side road. We do need to talk about documentation. One of the big challenges for us is to work out what improvisers do and what they have done. Now with Paganini, the most authoritative version we have of Paganini's Nel Cor was published apparently without Paganini's authority, but I'm going to get back to that in a minute, as part of Karl Wilhelm Goehr's not euphoniously named Kunst die Violin zu spielen, ein Anhang zu jeder bis jetzt erschienen Violinschule nebst und Spiel in einfachen Doppelton, etc. The title goes on for 5 lines. It's on the title page. Published by Schotz in 1829. Now, Goehr's pioneering work is today much maligned, and there's no question that there's a certain amount of what we call in England old rope to be found in it. However, it is the most useful source we have of Paganini's performance practice, and that's good enough reason to study it. Goehr, who was a Kapellmeister in Frankfurt, had qualities which would have impressed Paganini during his 2 visits to the city in 1829 and 1830. Like Paganini, Goehr was renowned as an orchestral disciplinarian. This is something Paganini is one of the few players we know who would shout out to orchestras demanding things to be right. And this resulted in uniquely well-prepared performances. And Goehr was also an inveterate showman. When Gaslight was introduced in his theatre for the first time, and there was a performance of Haydn's Creation, at the words, "Let there be light," he had all the gaslights in the theatre turned up as brightly as possible. Unfortunately, the gaslights, because of Paganini's medical condition, he couldn't bear bright light, and so when he played for Goehr with his gaslights, he would wear blue glasses on stage. Blue glasses, of course, not prescribed sunglasses, but they were prescribed to correct short or long sight. Paganini gave 5 concerts with Goehr in summer 1829, and the following year 4 more, including a benefit concert for the Kapellmeister. By that time, Goehr's study had been published. Now, if Paganini had been angry about this, their collaboration would hardly have continued. So at the very least, we can be sure that what Goehr left us enjoyed Paganini's approval. What we're really talking about is Goehr's notation of Paganini's improvisation. There's always going to be a question of how a musician can take down improvisation. And in this case, Goehr's given us this full imitation of this enormous piece, 17 minutes long, in great detail. Now later in the 1800s, Paganini's disciple Ole Bull gave up trying to notate accurately Norwegian folk music for the simple or complicated reason that Hardanger violinists, when he tried to write it down, never played the same thing twice. In the 20th century, think about how Messiaen and Bartók, with birdsong and folk music respectively, even they resorted to a double, if you like, a double practice of both recording and simultaneously writing up by hand as they went, not trusting either process by itself to give them the full result. However, balancing that is what we know of the skills of early 19th century musicians. So if you take Vienna, Beethoven was surrounded by musicians with astounding memorization skills. Franz Clement, who was one of Paganini's rivals on his first visit to the city in 1829, Clement played the Beethoven concerto for memory 2 days after it was finished. Now, I know there's a complicated story to that which I'm not going to get into, but just to move on to something else, he was also famous for having been challenged at a party after a premiere of a Hummel Mass to write a short score out for memory, and he did it. So in a world completely free of full score of any Beethoven quartets were not printed until 1826. There are no full scores, there are no bar numbers, there are no Buchstaben, no letters, no second takes, nothing to all intents and purposes that we'd recognize a rehearsal. Rehearsal consisted of playing stuff through and doing it wrong Or sometimes Beethoven was once found at breakfast after a night playing Pleyel piano trios with the 3 parts on the table in front of him, because of course the piano part didn't have the violin and cello parts, counting bars to try and work out where the mistake had been. In this context, 2 skills were absolutely vital for a musician. 1 was improvisation, and 2 was memorization. So I think we can probably comfortably say that Goer's version is as good as we can expect. There's a bit of a sidebar here. The Kassel-based violinist and perhaps charlatan Anton Bott published a collection of 6 extraordinary caprices for solo violin in 1834. These were written, quote, après la manière de jouer de Paganini, after Paganini's manner of playing. And it's very clear that Bott took a certain amount of this from Goer's book, which had been published 5 years earlier. And part of Bott includes a version of the Paisiello variations. Part of it has left-hand pizzicato passages which are stolen straight from Goer. But his version of the theme suggests something else. So this version of... he doesn't do Goer's version. He does this. Well, to me, I think he's heard Paganini playing. Of course, the other possibility is he wanted to include a version of the theme which was recognisable as being the theme, whereas Paganini's isn't. Just to lend a bit of weight to this, his 4th caprice from this collection begins extraordinarily with a tiny quote from the opening tutti of Paganini's 1st concerto. Notated in E flat, which of course is the correct key for the concerto. Because, of course, today we hear it in D major because Paganini played it with his violin tuned up a semitone with the orchestra playing in E flat. If Bott had only had the chance to see the orchestral parts because he was a second violinist in the orchestra which accompanied Paganini, no wonder he thought it was in E flat, which makes me pretty sure he was sitting there, that he heard something. But I'd like to look at this now from the other side of the curtain. Now, the great Belgian virtuoso Charles-Auguste de Berlioz was a rival to, and at times a thorn in Paganini's side. Although he was 20 years younger than Paganini, he'd established himself, quote, as that fine violinist from Paris in London by the 1820s, and Paganini's arrival failed to put a dent in the interest in his lyrical playing. In addition, he left us an enormous volume of violin alone. I mean, there are 4 books of astounding studies, which are glorious, and these amazing dramatic scenes for violin alone, and then these dual works that he wrote with his son, wordless operas for violin and piano. But amongst all of this, there is a piece which is titled very blankly, Prelude and Improvisation. I've been playing this for 20 years now, so I think I can express an opinion about it. It's always seemed to me a sample of Paganini-esque improvisation, or how de Berlioz might have demonstrated Paganini's improvising. Now, it's clear from all of his studies that he was a careful and very conscientious mimic of other people's playing styles. This 6-page piece, remember the bio we were talking about earlier, is without a theme, without bar lines, without a key signature, and without a stable tonic. Worth remembering the thing, any of you who came to the talk I gave about Viotti some months ago, about how Viotti talked about making a decision not to use bar lines in notating a piece of solo music. He said that to use bar lines would to be render it, and the French he used render it dénaturé, to denature it, if you like. So the choice not to use bar lines for a whole 6-page piece is interesting. And what I'd like to do is to go to that idea of depicting the passions, which I mentioned earlier, and take you through this, and maybe talk a little bit, violin in hand, about what improvising would elicit in a listener of the early 19th century. I would never do this to a piece of music, and so this is not music. This is going to be, if you like, a kind of... I've always regarded this piece as a kind of musical Baedeker to Paganini's approach. It begins sort of earnestly and noblemente, in a good preluding manner, establishing the tuning of the violin. continues that matter for a while. Now here's the first kind of thing of the, emotion finding its way in. Now we have increasing drama. Now remember the beginning of the Nel Cor. Now for the first time, Barrow introduces that kind of stuff. And here's the first Paganini giveaway. The generic diminished sevenths, which curiously are not really a figure in Barrow's other solo work. He doesn't usually use these kind of things. Now we have a two-part aria for a line. And then more melodrama, more Paganini stuff. And then absolute Paganini trick, which Vieuxtemps would then come to love, which is an arpeggio going up to here, which anybody who's played Vieuxtemps 4 will recognize. This, I see at least one person smiling who has played it. Then we have an absolute giveaway, the first instance of hysterical sautier after a kind of very macho. And then we have the first emotional thing written on the page, plaintif, so a kind of wailing section. Remember the thing of Leigh Hunt's poem of talking about Paganini's ghastly with whining stim. Then we have something which becomes very much cliched, kind of wave passages. Now, the sharp-eared violinist will recognize something from Paganini's 17th Caprice here, from the figuration in Paganini 17. And then back to this kind of interrupted drama. That goes on for a while. And then there's allusions to Paganini's tremolo playing, which comes in the middle of Nel Corpus there. So we have and then back to an explicit quote from Paganini. If I just go back to the opening of Nel Cor, remember this passage? Berio writes this. Sound familiar? And then he gives the absolute giveaway. So that is the simultaneous left-hand pizzicato technique. In fact, that's closer to the other piece which Goer also published a transcription of the Deux Merveilles, the sonata in two parts. A couple more kind of dramatic things. There's an example of what I would call Gothic ghostly writing in a minute, after another bit of wailing harmonics. Here we have a really exciting thing, which is what we've been talking about. Goer's version has been, if you like, a very, very dutiful reconstruction of what he heard Paganini did. It is an attempt to, as conscientiously as possible, to write down what he heard. What Charles de Berrier is doing here